Well, hello everyone, and welcome to Citadel for Life, the Lifetime Leadership Learning Series. We've got a special guest today, Mr. Mark Beal from the United States Department of Defense, who is working in artificial intelligence and is intimately familiar with some of the ethics issues related to the development of technology happening in our world today. So, Mark, just right off the bat, thank you for being here. Welcome. Please tell our viewers and listeners today here at the Citadel and in the larger Citadel family a little bit about your background, where you are, what you're working on now, and then we'll start diving into some of the ethics related issues.
Awesome. Yeah. Hey, Ted, thanks so much for the invitation to be here and to all the Citadel family. It's great to be with you today and share a little bit about my journey. So I'm originally a country boy from Central Virginia, very familiar with military academies, both VMI and obviously the Citadel. And I actually went to a military high school, although I didn't take that route in college. But yeah, I kind of had a little bit of a non-standard trajectory into government. I barely graduated from high school, and it wasn't until college that I kind of got my act together and sort of landed on national security as what I wanted to do. I was just to sort of share with you my age. I was a senior in high school on 9/11, and that kind of vectored me into national service. So from there, I went to Embry-Riddle Aeronautical University and graduated, and then went on to the Institute of World Politics, which is a small national security oriented school in Washington, and got my first job in government in the intelligence community at the Director of National Intelligence's office. And then from there over to the Pentagon and the Office of Secretary of Defense for Policy. And that's where I've been for the last, I want to say, 10 years or so, until I guess somewhat recently, where I was asked to come over and help stand up the Joint AI Center. And there I've been kind of working for the last couple of years, and I lead the Strategy and Policy Directorate.
So the Joint AI Center, or JAKE, is really on the cutting edge of a lot of technology. And I know we got introduced through Colonel Rosales, who recently left there. So I'm very grateful for that introduction. Why don't you tell us a little bit about what the scope of the JAKE is, what it is, what's their mission and purpose, and what it is that they've been, why were they stood up?
Yeah, I guess maybe we start our story back in early 2018. The head of the Chinese Communist Party, Xi Jinping, gave a big speech, 18-hour marathon, I'm thinking like a State of the Union, but for China. And on the background in the book on his bookshelf, there was one book, and that was called The Master Algorithm by Pedro Dominguez. And a lot of us in the Pentagon sort of took note and started looking a little bit into, what is China and in some cases Russia saying about this technology, and realized, hey, this is going to be a game changer. And we got to get into this game if we're going to maintain our military competitiveness over the long term against our our competitors. So we sort of surveyed the inventory, as if you will, of all the things that were going on in DoD AI. And there was a good news story, and there was a little bit of a concern. And the good news was that we were in some cases first movers in this technology, going back to DARPA in the 1960s, and in some cases even before. So we had a very strong cadre of specialists and researchers and scientists that had done a lot of groundbreaking work in this field. But where we sort of struggled was taking and harnessing that great research and driving it into our operations. And so we surveyed the inventory, as it were. We found hundreds and hundreds of these little sort of small scale AI projects going on. And we said, okay, what we really need is sort of a center of excellence or a strategic focal point. And we need to kind of get some technical infrastructure in place and some policy in place so that every DoD AI project is not just this one-off individual flower, but we're taking advantage of sort of economies of scale, and we're really driving toward operational capability. And so that's kind of the origin story of the Joint AI Center, and we were sort of born out of that realization. So we came to be in summer of 2018. We got our kind of first funding and our first sort of tranche of employees by September, and I was one of the first 6. And we had a very difficult mission, and that mission was to basically accelerate AI delivery at scale in DoD. And how do we do that, and what does that mean, and how do we architect this organization to meet that very difficult mandate? And it wasn't easy, but we sort of made a couple of interesting, I think, design decisions, and I'll just share with you maybe a few of those. The first is we married both a policymaking function and a product delivery function in the same organization, which is interesting and profound, and to my knowledge has never really been done before. And the idea here was that product delivery needs to inform policy, whether that's new policy or changes to existing policy, or potentially even removing existing policies. We wanted to kind of close that gap. And then, but then we also needed to figure out how to implement DoD AI programs at scale. So how do you reduce the technical infrastructure barriers to delivery? So a major line of effort, not just with specific applications and products, but also with platforms and capability that we call the joint common foundation. Imagine like an environment in which DoD developers can access and harness things like algorithms and data sets and even contract vehicles and so forth, so that all of the features of AI projects that are the same can be kind of solved for in that environment, and then our users and our developers can focus on the unique features that they want to build. And then obviously we have this sort of strategy and policy function, which I alluded to, and I lead that. And in that space, we do a lot of things around talent. So the workforce and how do we cultivate an AI-ready workforce? We do a lot of things with our international allies. We've had a lot of really great press recently on a new initiative we launched called the AI Partnership for Defense, which is a historic new initiative that the Jake is leading. We do a lot of work in public affairs like AI.mil. I encourage everyone to check out that website. It'll definitely look more like a startup website than a DoD website, and that was definitely by choice there. And then we have a tech policy work, and that's the organization that is responsible for governance and responsible and ethical AI, and helping reduce some of those policy barriers for supporting our product teams and our delivery mission. So in a nutshell, Ted, that's kind of our origin story and what we're up to.
Man, that is a lot of ground. To me, it sounds kind of like a GitHub for Department of Defense developers in AI. So they're playing in the same sandbox and they can kind of see whatever's working on. I would be very curious, before we start talking about some of the ethical branch issues, do you have to secure that sandbox? I mean, how do you make sure that the right people are in there and the wrong people are not?
Yeah, absolutely. And if we were to sort of take a brief step back and think about the broader kind of scope here. So under the leadership of the current Defense Department Chief Information Officer, this gentleman, Mr. Dana Deasy, he put forth his vision for the digital modernization strategy of the department. And within that strategy, there's kind of a couple of core pillars. There's data, there's AI, there's command and control and communications, there's cloud, which is like sort of the infrastructure piece that's foundational, but then there's also a cybersecurity. And without each of these pieces being put in place, then the whole program is at risk. So AI is in some cases maybe the sexiest, but cybersecurity is absolutely critical. And how we, and not just the sort of very compliance-based approach that we have today, but how do we think about industry best practices for allowing users to access the type of data that they need to access to do their job while protecting the other things. And I would suggest to you, Ted, from a technical perspective, a lot of these problems have been solved. From a policy perspective, it's bringing those people into sort of the 21st century in some cases, and helping share best practices from industry and so forth. But your point is right on the money. Cybersecurity is so foundational to everything we do.
Well, the speed of these things is also moving so quickly. It sounds like marrying product delivery with policy is probably wise, because I can only imagine that the AI itself or machine learning is changing and evolving so rapidly that how do you possibly keep up with that? We think of policy cycles as very long, 6 months, years, we're planning ahead. But in fact, as you mentioned, some of our near-peer adversaries are thinking about this too. Is there any type of, one question I heard that I wanted to ask you from a previous meeting we were in together is the Joint AI Center, is that something that's considered almost like a Manhattan Project level of importance inside the DoD? I mean, is this like so critical and so focused? Is there going to be a clear winner, I guess? Is that a discussion that, like, if we don't get to this first, we have a real security problem? Or is it kind of like we just need to stay ahead? Is there a threshold, I guess? When I think of the nuclear analogy, it's like, do we have the bomb? And is there an AI equivalent of that?
Boy, that is could be a very sensitive question, but
Okay,
I'll share with you my personal point of
sure.
view. I think at a big picture level, historical analogies are useful in some instances and sometimes they're not. So like if you have to be sort of responsible in how it is to use them. But I think the analogy of the Manhattan Project is actually a germane one. Or maybe it's the Sputnik moment might be another a historical analogy where a competitor of the United States, in this case with the Soviet Union and Sputnik, achieved a capability that we assess to be of significant national security risk. And we were not ready and postured to respond appropriately. And so there was this sense of urgency. Flashing forward to 2020 and AI and how that relates, I might say that it's similar in the sense that this is a general purpose technology that's going to fundamentally transform the character, potentially the character of warfare. And the United States is thankfully in the lead still. But we can't rest on our laurels. And every day that goes by that we're not delivering capability, we're not driving hard on our digital transformation agenda is a day that we're potentially losing ground to our near peer competitors. And so there's definitely a sense of like tactical urgency and also with strategic patience, recognizing that changing a 3.2 million person organization doesn't happen on a dime. And then maybe the last point I would make, and this is perhaps the most controversial, so this is only my opinion. When we talk about AI machine learning, we're really only talking about narrow AI. So artificial intelligence that solves very specific tasks. Imagine things like computer vision or image classification, or that's a dog and that's not a dog. I mean, like that's kind of the game that we're in right now. I would suggest to you over time, there will be growing capability and capacities in moving towards something that you might call a more general intelligence. So a capability that can you make inferences and look very much like almost like a human being in terms of its ability to process its environment. And some sort of security scholars would suggest that the country that harnesses that AGI, that general intelligence first, that might delineate sort of national power along the lines that nuclear weapons did in the 1940s and 50s.
Yeah,
And so
where
we're
that
watching that
threshold
very carefully.
where that threshold is a fascinating question. I'm sure many folks who are watching this have seen The Social Dilemma, discussing the ethics of AI in social media, and this concept that we always think of the singularity where the computers are smarter than our ability to go on the offense is not the only threshold. There's a threshold where the algorithms are actually able to work around human intelligence in ways that we're already experiencing, where essentially the threshold has kind of been breached. The question I have for you is, we teach our cadets and we talk a lot at the Citadel about leadership and ethics. And when I think about ethics, we think about problems that are difficult and don't have a clear answer. And then we talk about how our views feed into the frameworks, the ethical frameworks that we bring. We speak about ethical philosophies from history. We speak about the things we bring from our own cultures, from our own mentors, from the law. The Department of Defense is. I like to think that the United States operates with a higher ethical standard than other nations. Are there examples of where that puts us ahead of our near-peer competitors when it comes to technology and artificial intelligence, or holds us back? It actually, we have to be more hesitant than folks who might be able to do things with a different ethical perspective than we carry here in the United States.
So I would say a couple of things, Ted. I think first, I sometimes bristle a little bit at the notion that technology has ethics to it. I mean, at the end of the game, human beings have ethics. And if you want to know whether a various actor will act in an ethical manner, well, or use technology in an ethical manner, and you look at their track record. The Chinese Communist Party has a track record. And so whether or not AI is in play, that there's a track record there that's for all to see. So that might be the first thing. So, but for the United States, I think it's fair to say that at the center of our ethical construct, at least in the DoD, it remains and will remain the United States Constitution, and those sort of core principles around individual liberty and life and so forth are absolutely foundational to why we exist and what we do. I do think, though, there's a little bit of a nuance, and this is a nuance that our former Secretary of Defense, Jim Mattis, I think detected smartly. And he said, look, we have DoD has tons of experience in the research side of this equation with artificial intelligence. But when it comes to operations, we're a little bit less experienced. So we need to ask the question, is this technology somehow different than other technologies that we've adopted for warfighting capabilities? And if so, what are some unique principles that we need to put in place to ensure that we can adhere to our obligations under, for example, the Constitution or the other domestic law or even international humanitarian law? And so Secretary Mattis initiated this entire sort of process workflow with the Defense Innovation Board that resulted in these 5 DoD AI ethical principles that we've adopted officially in policy in February of this year. And so those principles are meant to kind of help guide implementation of our capabilities in such a manner that allows us to retain some certainty that we're doing this technology, we're implementing this technology in ways that are consistent with our values. But to your broader point, I don't think that slows us down. I think that makes us stronger. I think we could potentially field capabilities like China's fielding in Xinjiang or in Hong Kong. But we have restraint as a democratic country, and we choose not to do these things. We choose to put privacy on the table, and we have privacy laws. We choose to protect human rights and individual liberties where we can, and obviously we're imperfect, but we're continually striving to do better and better and better. And that's not what our competitors do. And I think that's an advantage of ours. And over time, that might result in some capabilities that we don't pursue, but it also will result in a sort of a stronger moral high ground for the United States and with our allies. And I think it's very robust capabilities that we can still deploy in the event that there's a unfortunate sort of contingency requirement.
Right. Well, I won't ask you to rattle off the 5 ethical principles, but I would love to hear the highlights. And another question that comes to mind is, obviously you're operating in the Pentagon and the Department of Defense. The Chinese, this is just one Marine's opinion here, but they've really been excellent at leveraging soft power around the world. Their Belt and Road Initiative, they're operating in parts of the world economically in ways that we just are not doing. Is AI considered a soft power or a hard power? And do we see it being deployed by other governments in ways that we can't or don't already?
I mean, AI is very much about hard power.
Okay.
And Chinese, messaging and influence operations use, I think, some concerns out there about AI and social impacts as a means to advance, a set of objectives. And I'll just give you a brief example. So last September now, I was in an event in Paris where, it was a U.S. Contingent led by the State Department. I was the DoD person. There was a number of European delegations, and there was a Chinese delegation. And the conference was about AI ethics. And as the lone defense guy, I kind of said, well, that's great that the elements of the Chinese system are talking about AI ethics, but I don't see anything coming out of the government. I don't see anything coming out of the PLA, the People's Liberation Army. And so the point is, it looks like to me that a lot of the talk coming out of the Chinese is really nothing, it's a little more than sort of public relations. Mm-hmm. And I have yet to see, I would welcome the PLA publishing a similar set of AI ethical principles or policy on autonomy and weapon systems, and anything like that to show some more transparency into how they're thinking about harnessing these capabilities. That would be wonderful. But heretofore, it seems like there's a lot of smoke, a lot of messaging, but not a lot of substance.
Are we ripe for something like that? Like you think of the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights after the Second World War. Are we ripe for something like that on the international stage, as sort of an agreement on a world scale of these types of weapons in warfare?
So the answer is unfortunately complicated. There has been a UN Convention on Conventional Weapons process in Geneva examining the issue of autonomy in weapon systems. So it's related, but not exactly the same as AI. And that process has sort of heretofore focused a lot on, killer robots and the risks posed by, sort of the future of, autonomous systems. And there's been progress. The United States remains very committed to this process. It seems to me that there's still some foundational pieces that are lacking in terms of common understanding of terms and so forth that makes a sort of global agreement in this space a little elusive. I also think that right now we're kind of, all of us, the allies at least, are a little bit in our infancy. And it would be unfortunate, I think, to impose a set of restrictions, which an international agreement like this could entail, prior to our sort of fully understanding and harnessing the capabilities for ourselves and knowing exactly what it is that we want and why we want it. And I think from there, we would be in a position of strength to go into a place like the UN or the UN Security Council and make recommendations
Sure.
about an international regime like that.
Sure. Well, as we kind of wrap this up, I want to be respectful of your time. I would love to hear what the general concept, if you can rattle off the 5 ethical principles, that would be great. If you could either encapsulate them or summarize them, that's fine. And then an example of where the rubber meets the road with those as you progress with artificial intelligence would be a great way to wrap up this interview.
Yeah, so thank you. I'll absolutely be happy to rattle off the 5. So the 5 ethical principles. The first thing I would suggest is the way you contextualize these or think about these. This is the framework or the means by which DoD can ensure compliance with our Constitution and with IHL, International Humanitarian Law, in the delivery of AI enabled systems. So like these are the systems engineering and responsible AI principles that undergird our ability to meet those requirements. So like that's the way that I think people should be thinking about them. So the first one is responsible AI. So systems are designed to have appropriate levels of human judgment and human accountability. And so if you were to deploy a system in such a way that an operator could take a series of steps that resulted in some action taking place, we needed to be sure that there's a measurable and robust accountability trail so that human beings can be held responsible for any violations or any bad outcomes. And this is not about blaming Sergeant Smith for a bad decision made by the generals. This is making sure that you get issued a rifle, you get trained on that rifle. If you fire that rifle in a way that's inconsistent with our tactics, techniques, and procedures, then you're going to face liability for that. And it's the same kind of concept with responsible AI in this case. The second principle is around the idea of traceability. So you think about computer code, and if something were to go wrong, is that code, can we go back and do a core dump, as it were, and access that code and kind of dig into it and figure out what happened and why? And so our systems need to be engineered in such a way that we can access those that information and trace any failure modes that may happen. A third principle is in the area of equitable. So what do I mean by that? It's not like fairness in the sense that we want to have fair outcomes for us and for our adversaries. No, it's not that. It's more that we need to engineer our systems and train our models in such a way that we're very cognizant of issues around bias in data sets. And so if you guys know much about machine learning, like there was a couple of really public examples. I'll just give you one really egregious one where a facial recognition technology was trained on all Caucasian faces. And then when it was presented with an African-American face, it classified that person as like an animal. And so it was a really awful thing. And it revealed in a very concrete way the dangers of machine learning and bias in data. So if you don't have robust, strong, complete data sets, and you train your models, well, you can imagine in a military context, if you train your models on a certain environment in Yemen, and then you deployed that situation, that same capability over to Afghanistan, you can't expect the same kind of performance. And that's something that we need to account for early on. So that's the third principle. And I know we're running out of time here, but just shift to the end game. And I think, so if I might say, how do we put these things into practice? Well, we're doing a number of things. We sort of frame this out as the 4 Ps. So first, policy, right? So, DoD, our programming language is policy. And unfortunately, even though I'm a policy guy, I tend to not like policy. We have too much of it, but we do need policy. So we're in the midst of publishing new policy that's going to guide, very important actions in DoD, so that these principles in the design and deployment and development of these capabilities are sort of uniformly adopted. The second thing is about our people. And so Jake implemented this responsible AI training program and created a 10-week intensive course for everyone that's involved in the sort of product lifecycle, and understanding sort of what their role is and ensuring that things like bias and our principles are upheld. So, and we've given them tools actually to help them do this. So I'll give you an example of something called a data card. So a data card is something that we ask our vendors or other sort of data owners to populate before we ingest any data set, and it provides some meta information about that data so we can make important inferences about it. So, you know, what kind of, not just like the technical information, like what's the file type and, you know, and so forth, but like, you know, what's the scope of the data? Is it imagery? And is it so, like, you know, what's the sort of the domain of the images collected? Is it only in one place or another? Is it a certain altitude or not? And so forth like that. So that's a really, really important, very tangible thing that we're doing to help ensure that we can meet our ethical principles like equitability. And then procurement activities. So when we procure something from the outside, it's important that we put in our acquisition and contracting language a reference to these principles, and signaling to industry that the Department of Defense is going to evaluate those capabilities that industry is offering to us with an eye toward these principles and ensuring whether they're developed. So DoD, we in the JAIC recently published a request for information or request for proposal on our joint warfighting operations mission. And in that RFI, you saw a very strong signal about the importance of these principles. So that's another tool that we have. And then finally, you know, sort of thinking about leadership and military ethics and AI safety, like our strategy kind of dictates. So how do we not just sort of take these principles and adopt them in DoD and work with our civilian counterparts in the US government to kind of help inform that process, but also internationally? How do we work with the allies and partners to ensure that if they're not adopting our same set of principles, that at least there's, at the highest level of policy level, there's some interoperability in systems design, so these principles can be sort of widely incorporated and sort of shared around. So in a nutshell, that's kind of a little bit about our principles and what's going on. And yeah, unfortunately, there's so much more work to be done, but I would say, you know, a couple of months, you know, 8 months or so after our you know, sort of official signing, I think we're well on the right track.
Well, Mark, I tell you what, our cadets, when they run around this campus, they all wear t-shirts that say ethics in action. And what you have just described, it's fascinating to know that something that is so high speed and could, you know, squirrel off in many different directions is guided conscientiously through ethical principles. I think that is absolutely heartening as an American citizen, as a military officer. And it's fascinating from the perspective of someone interested in the study of leadership and ethics, which we all are here at the Citadel. So I want to thank again Mark Beal, the head of strategy and policy at the Joint AI Center, for joining us today for the Citadel for Life leadership learning opportunity. And thank you so much, Mark. Fascinating talk. Really appreciate you spending some time with us.
It's been great, Ted. Thank you for the invitation.